So let's talk about fisheries for a moment. We count as indicators for our report card rockfish, shad, oysters, and blue crabs. Harvest of these blue crabs in particular has been called an economic engine for the bay. Delicious rockfish. We're probably all familiar with that. Now, they have been a success story after the population rebounded in the 1980s when it was on the verge of collapse. And some of you may recall a moratorium was imposed and numbers began to increase, and now rockfish can be harvested more again. But although the numbers are still high, there is increased concern in recent years due to a disease called mycobacteriosis. And these bacterial and viral diseases, I had to make a conscious decision when I came here today whether to include some pictures of people who were infected. And these are people such as yourself who are like getting their boat out of the water and got a little scrape. I didn't include them, and I don't with the kids because I'm afraid nobody will want to get in the water if they see these pictures. These things are still rare, and that is another reason I chose not to include them. They're still rare. This doesn't happen to everybody. The one disease, Vibrio, which I had the most horrifying picture of, usually affects watermen, and it's rare that it affected somebody who's not making their living on the bay every day. But the fish who live there, just like in my story about my dog running through the Gwynns Falls and getting sick later, they can't go anywhere else to get better. They are exposed to bacteria and viruses all the time. And that's why we really need to focus on making our bay healthier so that the system can fight the diseases. Mycobacteriosis is most likely caused by exposure to low oxygen levels and poor nutrition. So if the fish were healthier, they could fight the diseases better. Another problem with the rockfish is menhaden. Are you familiar with menhaden? Great. So you know they're a tiny little fish. They're used in a million different products and industrial uses, and they are overfished routinely for decades, especially by the Omega Protein Corporation. Omega Protein is based in Virginia. So Maryland, we have O'Malley, who's very friendly to these environmental causes. In Virginia, we're trying to get more pressure on this Omega Protein Corporation because the rockfish need the menhaden to eat, as do many other creatures in the bay. So this is what I'm talking about. This is not meant to be a partisan presentation. This is meant for you to lean on your elected officials, whoever they are, to do what we need them to do for the health, our health, and for the bay's health. Shad. I don't have much to say about shad, sadly, because there aren't very many. Pollution, migration barriers, which are dams, and bycatch and offshore fisheries seem to prevent any progress with the shad. Oysters, even though they have an F, I've got a lot to say about oysters because they are one of those keystone species. Just like what he was talking about with the grass, the oysters filter so much that when an oyster reef is planted, they've been using these concrete balls to plant the spat and put those in place and having partial success. But we're still working on it because the oysters are one of those keystone species. We get them in place, they cause everything to become healthier exponentially. Like there is a certain type of fish that hadn't been seen and people put in an oyster reef and lo and behold, the fish came back. Like they hadn't seen this fish for 50 years. And because there was an oyster reef, there was one of those fish hanging out. It's like the coral reefs that you see when hopefully you're lucky enough to go on vacation and go snorkeling. That's what the oyster reefs are like for the Chesapeake Bay. They provide a place for so many things to live. In the days when John Smith first sailed the Chesapeake, the 100% rating, oysters were so plentiful that the reefs protruded out of the water and were a navigational hazard. And now we're down to 5% of that population. So you may have heard like, oh, they tried this, or they tried this species, or oh, they tried this kind of planting, and it's not really working that well. We're still working on it, and the good news is the prospects for survival have improved substantially over the last 2 years, and it may be because disease mortality has slowed significantly with the oyster population. We believe that it is due to our efforts towards developing a disease-resistant oyster. This will take time, I'm not sure what everybody's majors are and what you're studying here, but anybody who's working on developing desirable traits in a species, is there anybody who's working on anything like that here? Well, it's pretty easy to imagine that this is the kind of science and research that takes a long time to get it right, but we believe we're on the way. Oysters have a long way to go. An adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a day, and that's why we're committed to getting the oyster population healthier, and it's going to help everything else improve. And then we're going to end on a high note here, blue crabs. The other highest grade, the other B+. The biggest increase in any of the indicators in 2010 is the blue crab. The Bay's blue crab population more than doubled from 2008. And that's primarily as a result of Maryland and Virginia cooperating to put in place tighter regulatory limits on crabbing, including cutting the catch of female crabs by 1/3. We still need to see substantial improvement in water quality and habitat for a fully restored crab population. It's like he was talking about the grasses. We need the grasses for the baby crabs to hide. So we still need to work on everything that's connected to it. But I like to look at the crabs and the rockfish doing well, despite the fact that our bay is only at a 31% out of 100, as a reason for hope. And the better the blue crabs and the rockfish do, the better everything else ends up doing. The grass beds provide the juveniles protection from predators, and that's one of the reasons they're so important. Obviously, if the babies can't live to adulthood, then we can't benefit from that. Yes?
The blue crabs, are they filters? Do they do anything to help?
I believe they do. I don't think that it's on the same level as the oysters, but I believe that they do.
Because they're bottom feeders.
Mm-hmm. I know you're nodding as if you might know more about that than I do.
They don't. No, they're more bottom feeders and stuff. They filter some, but not near the level of an oyster. But I mean, they're going to clean up a lot of your detritus and stuff that dies.
Excellent. Hillary?
Well, I was going to, last year we had a program about oyster fishing and oyster farming in the Chesapeake Bay. Did you guys think? And they had, I think they focused on one tributary that was in really, really bad shape, and they put in oyster beds. And then within like 6 months to a year, the water quality was like significant change.
These are excellent arguments for when you encounter the people that say, oh, the bay's ruined, there's no way to save it.
Well,
That's just...
the people who were part of this presentation also had restaurateurs who reuse the shells and give them back, and then they're washed and they're put back in the oyster bed, so that it's, you're giving back and making sure that it properly.
I'd love to hear about restaurants that are committed to things like that, because so many of them aren't. So many of them are packaging the food to go in different types of plastics, and I can't convince my boss to recycle. I had somebody come in and talk to him about providing a thing to crush cans, providing places to keep the cans, coming to collect the cans, and splitting the profits with him. And he still wouldn't do it. So I love to hear about the trend lately where more restaurants are doing things like that. It's just great. And did you have something to add? When they were talking about this oyster farming, do you remember, were they using the like the concrete oyster balls to build a reef, or were they using like?
They were using this. It was the form of the beds was not what ended up being approved for like the larger Chesapeake Bay. Like they were sort of like rafts that would float.
The floating ones.
Yeah, but then those are the ones that were not like approved or regulated by other people who were trying to bring oysters back into the bay. So they said that was a really effective method for getting oysters back and to be able to clean the water. But the one that I think was actually sunk down into the bottom, that's the one that ended up being approved overall for trying to raise oysters, and that had a less successful success rate.
Now, every time I get to go to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Merrill Center, have any of you ever been there? God, you have to go. It is so beautiful. But not just because the building is beautiful and sometimes when I'm sitting there and we're talking about these things, an eagle or a heron flies by, whenever I've gone there, it's never been a waste of time, and I always learn more, and you get to ask scientists questions. So I think I'm going to ask more about that. I wonder why the floats weren't approved, because I know the cement balls have had limited success. I'd like to learn more about that since the oysters are so important.